fun.
Yeah.
I mean, we have some of those events. We actually mother-in-law.
Good morning, everybody. Trying to get all our education committee members in the chairs here.
Herding cat.
Boy, yeah, herding cats. Okay, I'd like to welcome all the folks from the public and those from the LBA here today to present this report. We have about an hour and a half here. You know, we have enough time, I think, to at least become more informed on it. Everybody here on the committee should have a copy of the report with you, this blue copy right here. Mine has a lot of yellow highlighted areas throughout. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to have Jay Henry come forward here, and maybe Jay, you could introduce your staff you brought with you today and from the LBA. You have Christine Young and Paige Lorenz. So I don't know Paige from Kristen, or Christine.
Okay, good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Christine Young, the Director of Audits for the LBA. We are here to present the performance audit report for the Department of Education, Special Education, Dispute Resolution Processes. Paige Lorenz, an audit manager with our office, was the in-charge manager on this audit, and she'll present the report. And also joining us in the back from the Department of Education is Christine Brennan, the Deputy Commissioner. Also Diana Fenton, the Chief of the Governance Unit, and Becky Fredette, the Director of the Bureau of Special Education Support. This audit topic was recommended in Senator Reagan's 2021 final report of the committee to study special education dispute resolution options. And before I turn it over to Paige for the presentation, I'll note that this audit was presented to the Fiscal Committee on March 15th, and it was approved for release. The purpose of the audit was to assess the question, how effectively did the Department of Education manage special education dispute resolution processes during state fiscal years 2020 through 2022. We reviewed over 1,600 regulatory requirements and corresponding internal controls for 6 processes available through the department to help parents and schools resolve special education disputes. These were primarily issues related to students with an individualized education program, or IEP. The report includes a background section and 3 chapters. We will pause after presenting each section to provide an opportunity for questions or comments. And with that, I will turn it over to Paige for the presentation of the report.
Thank you, Christine.
Good morning. As Christine introduced me, my name is Paige Lorenz. Getting right into the executive summary on page 1. We found the department lacked adequate controls and did not effectively manage dispute resolution processes. Existing controls were limited, informal, inconsistently implemented, and not clearly documented or communicated. Dispute resolution requirements were unnecessarily complex, an issue we first reported on in 1991. Many department requirements were established through ad hoc rules, which could not be enforced. We also found department practices were not always consistent with laws and rules. Ineffective internal controls and the resulting issues we identified compromised compliance and transparency and potentially compromised state eligibility for federal assistance. Ineffectiveness also added unnecessary costs and barriers for parents and other stakeholders. Our recommendation summary begins on page 5. The department concurred fully or in part with all 20 of the observations in the report. 5 observations may require legislative action, which I will note when it's applicable. Our background chapter starts on page 11 and summarizes the state complaint, due process complaint, mediation, neutral conference, third-party moderated discussion, and facilitate IEPT meeting dispute resolution processes. Table 1 on page 12 provides the regulatory structure and type of contract for each process. State complaint, due process complaint, and mediation were federally required, while neutral conference, third-party moderated discussion, and facilitated IEPT meeting processes were developed and made available by the department. Starting on page 14, figures included in the background chapter also visually summarize the dispute resolution requirements for the 6 processes. Red text within the figures show federal or state requirements that were not followed in practice. Starting on page 21, figures 4, 5, and 6 include dark shaded boxes with white text, indicating unauthorized informal practices which were not established in laws or rules. Figure 7 on page 25 provides an overview of the organizational structure of special education dispute resolution process responsibilities as of June 30th, 2022. 6 full-time staff had supervisory or direct responsibility for dispute resolution processes. During the audit period, 5 of 6 staff had additional non-special education dispute resolution responsibilities. The 6th staff member eventually acquired additional unrelated responsibilities after the audit period. This concludes the background chapter. If there are any questions at this point.
Okay, from the committee, are there any questions on that? The next section we're going to get into is management control, and I think that's where we're going to have a lot of questions. Are there any questions so far? Paige, why don't you continue then, please?
Our management control chapter starts on page 27 and contains 8 observations addressing deficiencies systemically affecting special education dispute resolution processes. Well-designed, properly implemented, and monitored controls can help efficiently and effectively achieve objectives, ensure responsibilities are fulfilled, and ensure operations remain consistent. As we discussed in observation number 1, management oversight of the existing limited controls was ineffective, and management significantly relied on staff members' institutional knowledge to carry out responsibilities. Many operational deficiencies resulted, which adversely affected special education dispute resolution responsibilities, and known risks were unmitigated. Observation number 2 starts on page 31. The observation discusses lack of strategic planning processes or plans, aligning dispute resolution processes to department-wide mission to achieve objectives. Performance and decision-making were not supported by quantitative assessments, which negatively impacted operations. Examples are provided on page 32. Observation number 3 starts on page 35. Processes were generally managed independent of each other without adequate controls to ensure dispute resolution efficiency and effectiveness. There were no plans supporting organizational changes or assessments of staff responsibilities. As a result, noncompliance occurred and responsibilities were not always fulfilled. Observation number 4 on page 40 addresses stakeholder engagement and collaboration processes, which are critical for management to understand and set dispute resolution expectations. Formalizing engagement and collaboration processes could have helped the department promote transparency, support process improvement, and use resources efficiently. However, we found stakeholder engagement and collaboration processes were not formalized and varied among stakeholders. This compromised transparency and contributed to inefficiency and ineffectiveness. Starting on page 45, observation number 5 addresses effective contract management controls. We found existing controls were minimal and unimplemented, monitoring was inadequate, and management did not formalize training requirements. Contract terms were incomplete, and terms included in contracts were inconsistently fulfilled, which contributed to noncompliance. Observation number 6 starts on page 50 and discusses implementing strategic contracting processes to ensure enough qualified individuals are contracted for dispute resolution processes. Management did not ensure the department contracted with enough qualified individuals to fulfill dispute resolution regulatory and contract requirements, including for the scheduling of contractors. Additionally, some contractors did not conduct certain processes for which they were contracted for, as shown in Table 6 on page 53. Observation number 7 starts on page 55. The observation addresses controls over conflicts of interest for department staff, contractors, and parties to dispute resolution processes. We found controls were not comprehensive and conflicts of interest risks were not sufficiently mitigated. Impartiality and independence requirements for staff and contractors were inconsistently understood, implemented, and followed. Additionally, parents did not always know how to report potential conflicts of interest. We identified several actual conflicts of interest which occurred for one dispute resolution process during the audit period. Legislative action may be required to address our recommendations to establish comprehensive impartiality and independence requirements. Observation number 8 starts on page 60. The observation addresses developing controls to comprehensively understand monetary and non-monetary costs associated with administering special education dispute resolution processes. We found associated controls were inadequate, which resulted in waste and increased fraud risk. The department also did not objectively evaluate costs stakeholders incurred while using dispute resolution processes and identify improvements to help address costs. This concludes the first chapter. If there are any questions at this point.
Okay, are there questions from the committee? I'd like to roll back a little bit here.
Okay.
We're starting on page 29 in table 2. Under state laws, there's a source where the responsibility comes from. And I'm concerned that where the issue is not performed, not performed, not performed is mentioned 4 times. 2 times for the state, and then the others 1 or 2 times. When you're doing this, are you asking the question, why are they not performed in conjunction with state law?
We do. I believe that some of the areas we found was an unawareness of the requirement. So some staff just did not know this was a requirement. I'm not sure if this is, I believe in observation number 3, we talk about delegation of authority, and it's a contributing factor that it was established in laws and rules, but it wasn't formally delegated to staff. So
Several of us served with John Reagan when we went through this several years back and requested the LBA audit. And I think this is reflecting some of the concerns. Page 31, under observation number 2, management did not proactively evaluate and address issues or provide adequate oversight of controls. Consequently, dispute resolution processes were ineffectively managed, with negatively impacted NHED, New Hampshire Education, stakeholders. That's exactly what we were hearing when we went with the advocate, the special education advocate. And I'd like to know, perhaps a little later from the department, where are we on trying to ensure that this is occurring properly? And then I'm just going through some of the areas that I have, so maybe I can wake up some of the people on the committee here. On page 36, underneath inadequate controls over organizational structure, organizational charts incompletely reflected the reorganization. New Hampshire Education rules, guides, and manuals contain 90 outdated and discrepant organizational references, information on how the public could contact staff about special education dispute resolution processes was inconsistent, unclear, or outdated. Again, that reflects back to why John pushed for the audit. And then going on to page 18, under table 4, New Hampshire shall evaluate the effectiveness of alternate dispute resolution annually. No one responsible for it in table 4. Going on to page 45, under observation 5, where it says develop and implement contract management controls, special education dispute resolution contract management was ineffective. NHED lacked comprehensive controls. Existing controls were limited and unimplemented, and monitoring was inadequate. The question is this something that's been ongoing over the last decade? So that might be a question we can answer in a few minutes. Page 47, where it says regulatory non-compliance, New Hampshire ED lacked controls to ensure contractors complied with federal and state special education laws and rules during dispute resolution process. That's huge. And we're letting out contracts. Is there any accountability for these contracts? Are we getting the bang for our dollar? Going on to page 51. On the third paragraph down, or the second paragraph, starting with contracting and retaining enough investigators continue to be an issue. I know we're short, and so staffing over at Department of Education, is that an area that may be something that's been recommended by you, that the legislature try to maybe fund some of these areas? Page 52, in the second last paragraph in that page, staff acknowledged there were not enough hearing officers to comply with mediation scheduling requirements. It kind of linked with what I just mentioned. So I get that. Page 57, I'm almost done here. The first bullet, New Hampshire ED did not establish procedures to identify and disclose conflicts of interest for 5 of 6 dispute resolution processes. So the people that are being hired to do these, investigate, is there a conflict in terms of the contractor accepting and conducting these processes? Is there a conflict with that particular person investigating that contractor with the being too close, I guess, to some of these situations? Then I guess a big one for me is on page 61. Right on the top of the page there, last sentence, without sufficient cost tracking and controls, New Hampshire ED could not ensure state and federal funds were consistently expended appropriately. That's accountability for the dollars that we're appropriating. And the next sentence down, under inadequate contractor payment controls were inadequate and insufficient to reduce fraud risk. There's a word that we don't want to get into, the word fraud. I don't know if I'm getting close to where you ended. I had other areas, but I'll stop right there. So those are all areas which some captured my attention really quickly here. And it kind of echoes what Senator Reagan was after and we were after. I'd just like to know, where are we now in terms of addressing some of these really severe, significant issues? Is that a question for LBA or is that a question for DOE?
I believe that's for the department, if you'd like them to talk.
Okay. Other concerns or questions, Representative Cornell?
Thank you. It keeps saying management, and is there a definition of management, or who is management, or?
We define management as staff with the authority to supervise and make policy and procedural decisions on the operations. So literal management positions all the way up to the commissioner.
Okay, so it would be the commissioner assigning people to those positions, and they are supposed to do what?
The implementation, who's responsible for implementing the requirements.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Representative Woodcock?
Thank you, Chairman Leonard. Good morning. I'm sure you have all these questions in order. There'll be an
Yes.
answer, right? Yeah. Okay. But thank you. My question goes back, following along Representative Ladd's comment, but mine is a little simpler. It's one question or two. In the executive summary, when you offered the issues at the beginning, I figure it's page 5 or something. I'm not sure what number it was, but page 1. There you go. Thanks, Hope. And you outline in your chart on page 5 the issues and the concurrence and non-concurrence. My question is, what happens next with those recommendations, and who is responsible for that?
So the LBA's responsibility ends here. There is an executive order for the department to report on the progress of our audits. I believe it's first one is 45 days, or is it 90? I'm not positive the timeline, but they have to be reported to the Department of Administrative Services, and there's incremental reporting after that. During the fiscal committee meeting where we released this report, they also required, Christine, quarterly updates? Quarterly updates on the progress of the resolution of these findings.
Okay. May-
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Lett. So the 45 days or the 90-day follow-up direction, is that under that March 15th date that you said that or the report was released? When does
Yeah,
the clock, when's this clock start, I guess?
Yes, once the report is publicly released, the clock starts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Lett.
You're welcome. Further questions? Yes, Representative Cascadden.
Thank you. My question is, since this report is looking at data from 2017, has there been other legislative audits done before? Or is this the very first time?
On this topic,
Think
Oh,
this-
when you do an audit, then you break it out into different topics? Okay,
Right.
so yes, on dispute resolution.
so we reference a couple audits in our glossary.
Okay.
There's a 1991 and a 1999 performance audit. They weren't directly for dispute resolution, but they did have certain findings that were relevant to this audit. But this is the first time that we did an audit specific to dispute resolution processes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Further questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Lekis.
Thank you. Is there a person that is in charge of overseeing these specific, this particular department or this particular, dispute resolution? Is there one person who's responsible for making sure this all works?
So for the operational part, it is spread out across the department depending on which dispute resolution process. Monitoring is also part of that. That's also a different part of the department, which is one of the reasons why we have observation number 3, because of how it's spread out across the department. Yeah,
So currently, there is not a person that's responsible.
not for all
this.
6.
Okay, thank you.
I will say that 5 out of the 6 that fall under one manager's supervision. There are multiple staff members involved across the department, however.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Representative Terry.
Thank you. I'd just like to drill down a bit more on the question with respect to management. I presume that it would include 2 classifications of people, if you will. Those who are appointees, such as the commissioner, and full-time, perhaps career employees of the department, if that is correct, by the nodding of your head, or no, or words? I would like to follow up.
So management will consist of the appointees and classified and unclassified.
Okay, could you characterize the number or the percentage with respect to appointees as a percentage of the total and the full-time employees as a percentage of the total? Are we talking like 5%, 95, and 20, 80? Could you, since you're auditors, I would assume that you're going to have some kind of a fix on that.
We don't.
You don't know
We don't.
how many are employees, and you just know their management,
We
but you
didn't
don't
do a
know.
staffing analysis.
You don't know, okay.
So for the purpose of this audit, we didn't.
Would you say that it's likely that most of the folks in the management category are full-time career employees rather than appointees?
I believe that's true.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Further questions, Representative Myler?
Thank you, and thank you for being here. On the face of it, this appears to be a pretty damning report as it relates to the study that you've done. The one question I guess I have, and we'll get into more questions I'm sure later, but this has been a focus upon the department. What, in your review, what role does the local school district play, if any, as it relates to this report?
So we have not quite gotten to that point yet. There is there are monitoring and enforcement responsibilities the department has over local educational agencies or schools, which an observation in this does address their role limited to dispute resolution process requirements.
So is there a follow-up and the rest of your study that will then cover that particular area?
I'm sorry.
Right. Our office is currently performing another audit of the special education program. That audit will cover everything other than this.
Thank
So
you.
there is a larger audit that's
Thank you.
ongoing right now.
Yes, that's correct. We were, on this one right here, was due process, and that's where we ended up going the direction of the special education advocate, being separated from HHS and DOE. But we did not go into the other areas of special education, the whole gamut. We didn't do that. Yes.
Just another point was, you mentioned the concern about the loss of federal funds as a result of what you found in this report. Can you expand a little bit more on that, please?
Sure. So for receiving a grant award of federal funds, agencies have to develop internal controls to ensure that the funds are being expended appropriately and in accordance with the requirements of those grants. It happens to be that those internal control standards are the same exact standards that we use to audit agencies. And not so much for those 3 state processes that were developed, but for the 3 that are federally required, we found those internal controls were not in place according to the requirements of receiving grant awards. That's where we find they're potentially at risk at losing federal funding if federal monitors or the agency comes in and determines they are also not sufficient internal controls.
Just as a follow-up, on that point, do you have any contact with the federal agencies, or is that clearly within the purview of the department?
We do not, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions, Representative Damon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here and for your work. I have 2 questions. So one, you referenced that although there wasn't a prior due process audit, that there were some findings in the 1991, and I think you said 1999, that were relevant. Were those findings addressed, or are they still present concerns?
We noted them in observations as appropriate. Normally, we put in an appendix at the back to show the progress of the previous audit findings. However, since these are over 30 years old and federal requirements and state requirements have changed so much then, we didn't take them for one. So where we found long-standing issues from these findings, we noted them in those observations.
Okay, and then if I may,
Well,
and the audit that is ongoing, looking at the rest of special education beyond due process, when would that be expected to be reported?
We don't expect that audit to be completed until closer towards the end of this calendar year.
Man. And does that audit represent the same time period as this?
That audit, I believe, is just for 1 fiscal year.
Which one?
Is that correct, Jay? Yeah.
So-
That manager's not here at the moment, so he would be able to answer, but I think it's just for 1 fiscal year.
Do we know which one?
2022,
So it overlaps with this.
yes.
Thank you.
further questions, Representative Luno?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Along the same line as the question from Representative Damon, and thank you very much for being here and leading us through this very detailed report. Following on Representative Damon's first question, I'm jumping ahead a little bit into a statement that you make on page 70 under regulatory, but I think it applies under management control as well. In the last paragraph, and it refers to the 2 audits that Representative Damon was just referring to, but then it goes on to say, NHED reportedly had no plans to address recommendations in a relevant report released in November 2021, so much more recent than the earlier reports, by the committee to study special education dispute resolution options and the burden of proof and due process hearings. So the statement here is NHED reportedly had no plans to address the recommendations. I was wondering, did you get to a why they've got no plans to address some recommendations that were clearly relevant to this area?
Right, so when we say no plans, it's more of that internal control where there should be procedures in place to address recommendations from evaluations and audit findings. That's what we mean by no plans. They didn't have procedures in place to ensure recommendations and audit findings went through a specific process to remediate those issues. So that's why they hadn't established. It's a procedural control that just wasn't established. It wasn't that they didn't want to remediate findings. It's the procedures weren't in place to ensure that happened. Yeah.
Further questions, Representative Cordelli?
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and going through this with us. Follow up on a couple of points made. I think Representative Myler was talking about the costs. And I note on page 63, under your recommendations, develop and implement procedures to effectively determine costs associated with special ed dispute resolution processes for staff, contractors, and stakeholders. Refer that back to also, I think there have been references to complexity of the due process alternatives, and we've heard about that in testimony on prior legislation that we've dealt with this year. Would you agree that the complexity and in some places ad hoc rules that are actually encouraged at the local level add to the complexity and possibly add to the costs for the department, and also you highlight stakeholder costs, which we have heard about since I've been here. So is there a complexity factor associated with costs?
Yes, and I believe you mentioned that in part of the observation is that it's one of the major barriers that stakeholders reported, which either some reported that they would have to hire legal help because of that. Even as auditors, we found it very complex to understand these requirements. The ad hoc rules definitely contributed with the complexity because many of these requirements weren't known to everybody without being formally established in laws and rules. Which I believe may have a little section on that as a cost to stakeholders, those barriers.
Yes.
So I think it's mentioned in here also that we have, I'm sorry, thank you. We have the rules, we have state law and federal law, and in some cases, never the twain shall meet.
Yes.
And that we do have charts, and I'm getting a chart made copies of for everybody of where we have rules that go above and beyond state or federal law, which in my mind is two problems. Possibly the complexity is involved there as well, but as a legislator, I have problems when we have rules that go beyond laws that have been passed either federally or here in New Hampshire, because there is little legislative input other than JELCAR, who maybe aren't totally up to the level of knowledge that we're correcting this term. But is that maybe over-regulation on the part of the state in not in compliance with state or federal law? Is that part of the complexity issue?
So you're asking if having the standards in excess, is that over-relation?
The rules in excess of law.
We did look at the rules that were noted on that chart. I think we're skipping a little bit ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think observation number 10 references that standards in excess chart. What we actually found was that not everything that should be included was included on that chart. We did not have an opinion or conclude on whether those standards were appropriately in excess. We decided that was up for the department and the legislature to decide.
Thank you.
Further questions, or shall we go on? Representative Woodcock, and then we'll go on for further presentation. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just, I want to go back, I want to make sure I'm clear on this. On the page 5, 6, 7, the 20 recommendations, now that's the summary recommendations that came out of this audit.
Yes.
And when I asked what the next step was, and you said there's quarterlies, updates and those things, does this committee or who gets those? Who follow legislatively? Where do we see the progress? How do we get that?
So the Department of Administrative Services won the 45 or 90-day incremental updates. Those must be submitted to the Department of Administrative Services, and it's posted to Transparent New Hampshire, so it's publicly posted.
Okay.
And then the fiscal committee quarterly updates will be either informational or an agenda item on the fiscal committee meetings.
Okay.
That's the extent of those two.
Okay. All right. I'll probably know back to that in a minute. But
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Ladd.
Thank you very much. What, Representative Mauer, and then we're going to go ahead with the report.
Yes, follow-up. So who has the final oversight for the implementation and the monitoring of the recommendations from your report?
The department does. We only check in on prior audits and the status of prior audits if there's an overlapping audit topic or we're directed to go back to that program or agency.
So there's no legislative oversight to this report. It's basically the department then that has the ultimate management of the department basically oversights its report, correct?
Yes, and the fiscal committee can request that the department comes back and continues to report on the progress of the findings in our reports as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think you can take us further into the report here, and then, yeah.
All right. Regulatory framework chapter starts on page 65 and contains 6 observations. Federal law and regulations frame the special education program and establish procedural safeguards. State special education law impose additional dispute resolution requirements, well-designed, consistently implemented, routinely monitored, and refined requirements could have helped the department ensure compliance and safeguard parental rights. Observation number 9 addresses implementing federal requirements. The department lacked controls to ensure rules consistently and timely adopted federal procedural requirements. We identified 58 federal requirements not adopted in rules, 23 incomplete rules based on federal requirements, and 13 rules that conflicted with federal requirements. Federal requirements were also inconsistently implemented, followed, or enforced. Observation number 10 starts on page 69 and discusses the development and implementation of state requirements. The department lacked controls to ensure statute and rules were effectively designed, comprehensive, and clear, which contributed to ad hoc rulemaking. Statute and rules were inconsistent with one another and at times did not reflect federal requirements. State requirements were also inconsistently implemented or enforced, resulting in noncompliance. Statute did not include authority for 2 of the 6 dispute resolution processes available. Legislative action may be required to fully address our recommendations to improve state dispute resolution requirements, including for ensuring the department has authority to implement all processes. Observation number 11 starts on page 73. The observation discusses complying with the Administrative Procedure Act, RSA 541A. Rules were unnecessarily complex, which was a long-standing issue. Several chapters and sections of rules contain requirements for dispute resolution procedures. However, it was not clear which rules applied and when. Many dispute resolution practices and requirements were informally developed over time without appropriate adoption of rule. We identified 472 ad hoc rules in our review of requirements and 80 ad hoc rules in a separate review of 23 department guides, manuals, and other published materials. Starting on page 77, observation number 12 addresses developing policies and procedures. The department lacked written policies and procedures for training, monitoring, and administering dispute resolution processes. Lack of policies and procedures negatively impacted operations. Examples are provided on page 78. Observation number 13 starts on page 80. The observation addresses improving the department website, guides, and manuals to ensure requirements are publicly available, understandable, and effectively communicated to stakeholders. Stakeholders reported department published information was difficult to understand, unclear, overwhelming, and it was hard to find specific information. We identified 339 issues with the website, guides, and manuals. Examples are in the bulleted list on the top of page 81. Observation number 14 starts on page 82 and discusses providing training and education to stakeholders to ensure expectations and requirements are understood and effectively communicated. School representatives were not always aware of certain requirements, and some stakeholders reported a need for training and education. However, the department did not provide proactive training and education for dispute resolution requirements and did not identify groups of stakeholders which would benefit from receiving training and education. This concludes the second chapter if there are any questions at this point.
Are there questions from the committee regarding this chapter? I'd like to go back to page 71, please. And there's two sets of bullets there. We're using words not consistently or clearly implementing. The bullet that says report on whether LEAs took corrective action to comply with federal and state law. In monitoring, I would think that that's something we'd want to do after going through a due process and then monitoring corrective action. How did you assess that this was not being done?
We were informed and we did not find evidence that dispute resolution monitoring was part of the department's program. So special education monitoring was happening, but not specifically for dispute resolution processes.
Mm-hmm. And the last bullet there says enforce a requirement that LEAs provide a written report within 90 days of a due process hearing, describing, etc. So that didn't come in either from the LEA to the department?
Correct. That was another requirement that we found was not formally delegated to ensure it was being implemented.
Okay, and that, is that a department issue or is that a local school district issue?
The department is responsible for ensuring the local schools
Okay.
follow requirements.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Cornell.
So to get back to Representative Chairman Ladd's question, do the LEAs know that they're supposed to do that? It sounds like there's not a lot of communication to the LEAs about what they're responsible for.
Right. So we did ask, I do not remember if we asked this specific question, but we did ask certain procedural requirements in our local education survey, and we found some of those, many schools are not aware of those requirements. I'm not sure if this was one of those that we asked about.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I'll follow up with, does DOE, I read in the report, and I don't know where, but many of this is done because the staff member at DOE has a historical background of how things did occur. It's not necessarily written down in a book. It's just, I have the history of this process, and then folks are changing or leaving their position and you lose that history. Is that sort of what's going on here? That we have, it's understood by this person leaves and the whole process leaves with that person.
Right. And so our policies and procedures observation and addresses that as well. A lot of the institutional knowledge was reliant on staff who had been there for not that many years. There was one tenured staff member of the 6 who were part of the dispute resolution processes who was also nearing retirement. So there was a huge risk of knowledge loss at that point.
Further, yes, Representative Cordelli.
Thank you. I think that a lot of this section relates to what you talked about, overlap with the LEAs. And I recall that when we first started the performance audit and looking at the scope of work, several of us submitted issues that you weren't looking at the local level when looking at due process. You were just looking at the state level. And so, I'm very glad to hear that I knowing how broad an issue special education is, that there is a separate audit that will address some of these areas and hopefully some of this overlap, because again, on page 71, where Chairman Ladd was talking about, it says state law required LEAs to notify the department when a parent had rejected an IEP, placement, identification, or evaluation. And again, we've heard testimony on that issue previously this year. And I think that will be something I want to bring up when we get into another step, maybe the next section of the audit review. But I think that that's troubling for both the state and for the parents when they've rejected, let's say, an IEP recommendation, and they're in limbo in many cases. So I think that some of these might be easily corrected, and that's my hope, and we'll keep watch on it. Thank you.
I'm going to slip back to page 67. It's in the, sort of in the same ballpark that Representative Cordelli is speaking to. There's, where it says additionally, comma, rules, the last bullet there struck my attention here. It says, did not establish a process for parents to open due process hearings to the public despite being a federally established parental right. So it gets back to my curiosity is, do the local school districts know, we supposedly have directors that are on top of directing special education at the local level, but are they knowledgeable of all these requirements that are in IDEA?
As I stated before, we did ask about certain requirements. Unfortunately, because the local processes were not monitored or reviewed during the processes, much of what we would like to know was happening at the local level was not auditable at the state level. However, that's why we have the training and education observation, is because we did find that there are certain requirements that local education agencies specifically stated they were unaware of and would like more training. So I hope that answers your question.
Is this a responsibility of the department or responsibility of the local school board?
It's the responsibility of the department to make sure that requirements are being followed and in accordance with how they should be followed. I think it's both, but it starts with the department.
Thank you. Further questions? Representative Mylan?
On that point, did you have an assessment of, excuse me, did you have an assessment of the relationship between the department and the LEAs across the state? I mean, is there a close working relationship between the department and the local school districts? Is there an estrangement between the two of them? I mean, what is the communication issues that are between the two?
So for this small of a scope, we did do the Appendix D has the educational agency survey. It wasn't a great result. 22% of the LEAs filled it out, but the results were generally positive. There were some certain areas, like I said, they expressed more assistance or better procedures. But as far as the relationship between the LEAs and the department itself, it was pretty positive.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. You, Representative Luno?
So thanks very much, Mr. Chair. This isn't directly related to regulatory or management, but sort of just in general. Was wondering if you got any sense as to the percentage of complaints that arose from students attending public schools compared to charter schools, or if there was because the LEA, the public school, is responsible, right, for special education services at the chartered schools as well. But just wondering if there was maybe a proportionate percentage of the complaints coming from charters or disproportionate.
So we didn't include the demographic data in our scope
Okay.
of file reviews. I'm sure the department might have a little bit more information on that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Peternell.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my question. What is the federal oversight of the implementation of these requirements? Because we're talking about the department's requirements to implement them, but how does the federal government get involved in overseeing the assurance that these regulations are implemented?
I'll let the department continue on that answer, but as far as what we saw in the federally required reporting, it's very limited to certain, for dispute resolution, it's a very, 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 very small portion of oversight. Limited to certain targets or percentages of completion or success rates, or which is resulting in a formal agreement for some of these processes. I'm not sure what else is part of that because we didn't look at that process, but the department will be able to speak to that.
I can also just add to that, the state of New Hampshire has an annual audit of the state's federal assistance programs. That's an annual audit of federal expenditures. So KPMG, the statewide auditor, performs that audit, and there would be findings in that audit if there were any issues that came up with the special education program. That audit is submitted to the federal government each year.
Okay. Want to go forward?
Sure.
Thank you.
Our performance and enforcement chapter starts on page 87 and contains 6 observations. Effective performance management helps provide a basis for making objective, data-informed decisions. Well-controlled enforcement procedures could increase the likelihood outcomes are efficiently and effectively achieved. Observation 15 starts on page 88, which addresses developing and implementing performance management controls. The department did not have sufficient and accurate data to evaluate efficiency and effectiveness of dispute resolution processes. There was no department-wide tracking or monitoring of dispute resolution processes to identify trends and address issues. Available dispute resolution processes outputs were limited, unreliable, and primarily focused on federal reporting requirements, while other quantifiable goals, objectives, and targets were not developed, resulting in noncompliance with state reporting requirements. Observation number 16 starts on page 93. The observation discusses monitoring and enforcing local educational agency compliance with dispute resolution requirements. The department did not monitor compliance and implement required enforcement actions for noncompliance. Without effective oversight, the department could not provide reasonable assurance the rights of children with disabilities and their parents were protected. Observation number 17 starts on page 98 and addresses developing controls over dispute resolution agreements. The department lacked controls to ensure agreements were compliant with requirements and implemented as required. Public transparency was compromised, and parents were inappropriately burdened with enforcement responsibilities. We also found dispute resolution agreements to be generally unregulated, resulting in stakeholders expressing concerns about the use of certain terms and conditions. Parents reported fears of violating agreements because of these terms and conditions. This directly affected legislators, the departments, and our ability to obtain quality feedback for process improvements from these stakeholders. We make a recommendation for the legislature to consider reviewing usage of agreements and determine whether state policy changes regulating aspects of agreements would benefit participants and improve dispute resolution processes. Observation number 18 starts on page 101. The observation addresses developing a public communication system to ensure complaints are fully addressed and external communications are timely and effective. We found the department did not establish and publicize clear lines of communication, including instructions and laws, rules, and guidance for stakeholders to formally file requests and complaints. Allegations were not always fully addressed, and noncompliance with certain notice and posting requirements occurred. Legislative action may be required to address our recommendation to update and ensure dispute resolution process filing information is accurate. Observation number 19 starts on page 105. The observation addresses records and data management controls. Reliable records and data are necessary for measuring performance, supporting decisions, and evaluating risk. Records management controls should be developed in accordance with relevant laws and rules. We found the department lacked records management policies and procedures, resulting in records being incomplete, missing, or untimely provided to management. At times, records lacked sufficient documentation and were not auditable. Observation number 20 starts on page 110 and discusses improving management of confidential records. The department lacked controls to ensure deletion of personally identifiable information from due process hearing decisions was conducted in accordance with federal requirements. Additionally, the department's ability to effectively manage two dispute resolution processes was limited in part due to unclear and conflicting record restrictions in state law. Legislative action may be required to address our recommendation to remove conflicting record requirements which hinder effective management of mediation and neutral conference processes. Appendix A, C, and D are at the back of the report. Appendix A is our scope, objective, and methodology. Appendix C is our special education dispute resolution parent survey, and Appendix D is our dispute resolution local educational agency survey. This concludes the third chapter and the rest of the report, if there are any questions at this point.
Yes, Representative Cordelli?
Thank you. We've talked about controls, tracking, and here on page 89, I think being a former IT guy hits me in that it says due process timelines not sufficiently tracked in the database for reporting requirements. Staff acknowledged the database was outdated and insufficient tracking needs. We've talked about this a little bit, and for years I've heard about the database, and I forget the acronym, NESN or something, or maybe that's a TV channel, I don't know. I took the opportunity to, just glance through and found at least 4 or 5 specific special education databases. One with PowerSchool, a module of PowerSchool, which a lot of districts use, I believe. And Connecticut, just 3 or 4 years ago, had a system developed for them, and I've got, I think, the majority of the functional specifications that they used for that. But I think that a new system to manage special education that would be used by all districts, not just some of them. I even heard just recently that maybe the current system has some abilities in it for tracking that haven't been used. So, I think what we need is someone to come in and do an evaluation of the current system, what is outdated, what functionality is there, what functionality is not being used, and then look at that in comparison to some of these other systems that are available that I think would help immensely in terms of controls and tracking, which are 2 of the major areas covered in this report. So that's number 1 for me, but maybe number 2 and 3 on page 99. And this I've led, you have your legislative to-do list. Well, I've got my own. And one of those comes on page 99, where it says some parents reported feeling forced or pressured to sign agreements and left no other options to obtain necessary services and fearful of retaliation. We've heard that from parents in the past, and that's on my legislative to-do list. Then on the next page, 100, we suggest the legislature consider reviewing usage agreements, including non-disclosure and non-disparagement clauses, to determine whether policy changes are needed. I would say yes. And I worked on legislation for that. We'll see what happens in the future. But certainly there are for mediation and some of the due process hearing processes, there are federal requirements in terms of non-disclosure. But in many cases, from what I've heard from parents, non-disclosure agreements are required as a beginning step to go forward with the mediation or something, which is not required under federal law. So I think that's another area where we can have an impact with legislation in the next session, if not with non-germane amendments on Senate bills. Thank you.
If I could just clarify, the databases that we're talking about for dispute resolution are separate from
Okay.
the special education, I believe the acronym is NESIS, New Hampshire Special Education Information System. So that system handles all other aspects of special education or most. And
So this is
there's separate,
it's a separate database?
there's multiple spreadsheets and databases as part of this. Yeah.
So am I correct in my thinking that maybe one comprehensive system to combine some of those spreadsheets and miscellaneous other data sources might help with tracking and controls?
I believe the department, I'm not sure if they put it in their recommendation or their response specifically, but I believe the department was looking into other options.
Right, and I see one was Salesforce that's in use by other departments, and my big notation there was no. We need something to address special education.
Yes, Representative Luno.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just sort of a process question. Does the state need to make its own state laws in order for the Department of Education to enact rules to comply with federal law?
Can you rephrase that a little bit?
So just as Representative Cordelli was talking about, there's federal laws and there's state laws.
Yes.
And the rulemaking, that all the departments do, basically have an underpinning in statute, in state law. But I'm wondering, can the department conduct rulemaking using a federal
Yes.
law as its underpinning?
Yes, so for the state complaint process, there's actually no state laws for state complaints. It goes straight from federal to the rules.
Okay.
And that's fine. We still identified issues between connecting those two, but you don't need to connect with the state law between those two.
Okay, and I know it's in here somewhere, and you probably talked about, so let's follow up. Is there additional rulemaking that you're recommending that the Department of Ed do in order to be compliant with federal law?
Yes, so the federal requirements, observation number 9, if I have that right. That's most of the areas where we talk about the federal requirements and the rulemaking
Okay.
aligning with each other. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, Representative Woodcock.
Thank you. Going back, no, okay. But the 20, I just want to make sure I understand this report, because I looked at it, I read through the executive summary twice, and I sort of scanned this. So the reports that you talked about going through follow up at each part of the executive summary. They just elaborate what was in the executive summary, right? Okay, so Representative Lekas a while ago asked the question about, she was trying to find out, I think, who's responsible for what. And then we talked about additional special education ongoing or soon to go another audit. So I'm looking at page 25, going back just to the table of organization. So, and I'm probably incorrect, and that's what I'm going to ask you to help me here. I'm assuming that when it says offer the commissioner, you're talking about the Commissioner of Education, Commissioner Elba, right? Okay, that's the big guy.
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of this audit, which only covers 2 years, 20 to 22, but is huge in terms of the implications of lack of oversight and regulatory work here. Now, am I looking at the left-hand side, the governance unit, that's what all this falls under, and on the right-hand side is gonna be the additional audit. Is that how we look at that?
Right, so these two sides are both dispute resolution. Yes, the majority of the special education audit is going to fall under the Division of Learner Support, Bureau of Special Education Support. That's where most of the next audit.
The next audit, okay, so you almost can write a line down. This audit's on the left-hand side, the next audit's the right-hand side. So some of the issues that Representative Milo had and Cordelia were talking about, local school boards, and their interactions and those types of referrals are gonna be on more on the right-hand side report.
Right.
That hasn't come yet. But, so all of these, extraordinary issues, only for just the last 2 years, not only how long it could have been beyond that, all on the left-hand side, for the most part. Buzz, is that right?
So, yeah, so 5 of the
Yep.
6 processes are on the left side.
Right,
One of the processes and monitoring responsibilities
middle,
are on the
okay.
right side.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and may I just follow up with, okay, thank you. So I'm looking at what the part I think Representative Luno referred to. What I have a hard time understanding is well over 75% of your 20 recommendations, the department concurs that they're accurate. And then there's some partially. How does that happen? That you have an exhaustive report that identifies 20 major flaws ongoing on a daily basis, and they respond concur.
It depends. Sometimes there may be disagreement with the facts in our observation and not specifically the recommendation. Sometimes the department may feel that the recommendations are not feasible to implement.
So if they're not feasible to implement, they just don't do it?
It may be, it depends again. I'm not speaking directly for the department.
Okay,
But
okay.
if it sometimes if they may not be able to implement because they feel there's some kind of statutory restrictions or resource restrictions,
Yep.
and it's really up to them to determine whether it's cost effective and makes sense to change those or request more resources. So
And one more simple
Yes,
one.
go ahead.
Thank you. Last one, this has nothing to do with this. Can you tell me how many hours the staff invested in doing this audit? Your staff, your department?
we have that
Ballpark.
number, but not on us.
Huh?
We do have that number. We don't have it with us today though,
Okay,
so
I'm
I'd
just-
have to
yeah, I
go
was
back
just
and take a look
curious.
at
I mean, it's so
that.
exhaustive. I was curious how many hours of research. Okay,
It's a lot of effort.
yeah, it seems like it.
Started this audit in March 2022. So
2 years ago.
yes, and I had 2 to 3 staff in and out during that time period.
Wow. Okay, hey, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Ladd.
Thank you. Page, when you're doing this audit, I'm looking at page 111, and looking at contractors and processes that have or have not been followed. I reference FERPA, using their own private email to address confidential issues dealing with the IEP. In your looking at contractors, and because it's been mentioned throughout here, is there a process you found that's fairly consistent, that there's criteria spelled out, there's a handbook available to contractors, what their responsibilities are? They shall report, they shall do this, this, and this. Is that available to the contractors?
So it depended on the contractor. The hearing and the process. So the hearing officers we found who were responsible for 4 out of the 6 processes did have more robust requirements and a handbook. However, we also found that the handbook was not required and the information within it was not being enforced.
So there's no oversight?
The management control part, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Representative Luno.
So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Along those same lines and sort of along the lines of what Representative Woodcock was talking about, there seems to be a lack of there's consistency in the report. I'm talking about in response from the department to some of the findings and recommendations in the report. For example, on page 68 under regulatory framework, where the department concurs only in part with the recommendations, the department goes on to say, the governance unit has processes to help ensure that it complies with federal and state timelines and assess where these procedures can be developed so that they're more comprehensive and formal. So they say that, that seems to be where they disagree with either your finding or recommendation. But then on page 89, so that's in regulatory framework, and then on page 89 under performance and enforcement, one of the findings is, so this is in the middle of page 89, we reviewed a judgmental sample of 12 due process complaint cases out of 115 from fiscal years 20 to 22. We found due process timelines were not sufficiently tracked in the database. So here we've got an example of where the department disagrees with a finding under regulatory framework, saying that they've got the process in place, but then under performance and execution, clearly they don't have the process in place. And I guess this isn't so much of a question, but to you, but maybe a question to the committee. Do we need to do a crosswalk between regulatory and performance and management controls to see where maybe the department's response is inconsistent with findings found in other sections of the audit? So this is a question to you, Mr. Chair.
I want to be very careful not to start treading into the executive responsibilities. And what our responsibility is, of course, we write law. And we are looking to see if is that law being adhered to right now. And I'm concerned, my concern, I guess, and maybe you've mentioned this to fiscal as well, if not, I will. I understand approximately, this is an approximate figure, a huge, maybe 80% of our staff over at DOE are paid through federal dollars. And we appropriate the dollars for the other side. And I might be off percentage one way or the other. And my concerns is that in your looking at this, have you found that there has been an effort to comply with federal law and state law? However, we're limited by the number of staff which we have over there that are dealing with due process here from both the federal and the state perspectives. So did you see that, you know, if in looking at all these recommendations, which is so many in there, and I see responses also from the department, but do we have the staff to do what we need to do?
I'll let the department answer that when they come up. Observation number 3, though, does include some of our concerns about the current staffing levels and the workloads, which is one of the reasons why I believe we recommend should be an evaluation of responsibilities for these processes. So.
Okay, thank you. Further questions from the committee? Are we at the bottom line yet?
We're set if you're set. And then
Okay, are there any further questions of the LBA? Nice, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for a thorough job. Appreciate it. The department, are you willing to maybe respond to some of our questions which we had or issues that have been brought up? You need another chair for all of you, don't you? Okay, okay. Is the red light on? There you go.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Christine Brennan from the Department of Education, Deputy Commissioner. Thank you for having us, and we appreciate the opportunity to address the concerns raised regarding the Department of Education's dispute resolution process as outlined in the recent auditor's report. We want to thank the auditors for their hard work on this report, and our robust conversations to improve the process were helpful, and they were helpful insights to consider. Our New Hampshire Department of Education is committed to ensuring that the rights of children with disabilities and their families are protected, and we believe that early resolution of disputes will lead to positive outcomes for children. As someone who has dedicated their career to the field of education, I have had the privilege of sitting through countless individualized education program meetings. These experiences have given me firsthand insight to the challenges faced by families navigating the special education process, which is designed to ensure that children with disabilities receive appropriate services and supports tailored to their individual needs. This process can often feel daunting, especially for parents who are navigating it for the first time. I also understand the need to provide ongoing professional development to LEAs so that they are clear about the statutory requirements which servicing children with special needs. Each member brings their own perspective and expertise and experience to the table, which can sometimes lead to disagreements and misunderstandings. When an IEP team is not functioning collaboratively, students lose out in learning opportunities. The department is committed to making significant strides in this regard using the audit as a tool. We want this to be our North Star. We have implemented various measures aimed at streamlining the process and providing clearer guidance and ensuring that all parties feel valued and heard. The Department of Education is committed to transparency and accountability for our operations. We are actively working to improve public access to information regarding the special education dispute resolution. We've been collaborating with stakeholders to create a parent guidance document. Our staff is bringing all of the parent guidance documents, the policies, as well as of our audit to a training and work session with the National Center of Systematic Improvement. They are a national technical assistance organization, and they're funded by the Federal Office of Special Education to assist specifically with the estates in developing policies and procedures and to ensure alignment with the IDEA and our state regulations. They will also assist us with formalizing our process in a comprehensive manner while ensuring that we are compliant with state and federal law. Monitoring enforcement and compliance is a top priority. Recently, we changed our monitoring practices. Our dedicated team monitors performances of schools, conducts systematic audits incorporating information from our staff and governance to take action, solve problems, and address any instances of noncompliance. We see the need to improve our collaboration with stakeholders and bring some of our processes to the 21st century to address changes and challenges. We plan on using technology, and we're researching ways to make our system more automated and give families more access and guidance about the dispute resolution process and the options that they have. As we move forward, the department is deeply committed to safeguarding the rights of children with disabilities and with their parents. Our procedures are designed with stringent adherence to federal and state laws governing special education. Any deviations or perceived shortcomings will be addressed promptly and with continuous improvement efforts. I also know that we need to be working together to pertain some of this effective management. Some of these initiatives will need to be done legislatively. Currently, we have HB 443 and HB 480. 443 is about the individualized facilitated, is that the right terminology?
No, that one's neutral.
Oh, that's the neutral conference one, where we need to embed some of our practices into another dispute resolution process. And then 1480 is for the facilitated IEP person. In this current legislative session, we are direct responses to the audit findings, and we look forward to continuing to work collaboratively with this legislative body to address the concerns that were raised in the audit. The department also looks forward to working collaboratively with stakeholders, including parents, educators, hearing officers, investigators, IEP facilitators, and we can continue to improve the dispute resolution process and ensure that every child receives a support they need to succeed. In conclusion, while we appreciate the audit's findings as an opportunity for reflection and improvement, we maintain that the New Hampshire DOE's management of the special education dispute resolution process is aligned with our commitment to serving the best interests of children with disabilities and their families, and we embrace the opportunity to improve. We remain dedicated to continuous improvement and welcome ongoing collaboration with stakeholders to further enhance our practices. I am confident that we can create a more inclusive and equitable educational landscape for all the children in New Hampshire. I have with me Attorney Diane Fenton, who oversees our governance unit, Rebecca Fredette, who oversees the Bureau of Special Education. And I have to say, your questions were fantastic. So I look forward to answering some of these and making sure that we have a really clear understanding of what's happening here in the field and in our office.
Thank you very much. Are there questions? Yes, Representative Hall?
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm just curious, what was the overall reaction with the DOE when you saw this audit? Were you like shocked? Were you expecting those results?
So I think that I was a little bit shocked because I do feel like we have processes and procedures in place, but I recognize that they need to be more formalized in a comprehensive way. That was my gut.
Thank you. Representative Myler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Brennan, for being here. It's nice to see you here.
Thank you. Nice to see you too.
I have a couple questions. How many staff do you have in the special ed department dealing with the whole schmoogle here that we're talking about, investigations, follow-up, et cetera? Then my first question is, how many staff do you have to cover this department?
So I'm just going to give a general, not a specific number to help you understand. So in our governance unit, people that are dedicated to the dispute resolution process, which is separate from Rebecca's office, because we really want to keep the integrity of the process separated from what they're doing at special education to maintain good relationships with our LEAs. So we have six or five, Diane? 6 people in our office, and then we contract with investigators that are not part of our staff, but they're contracted people, and I think it's either 5 or 6. The same thing with the hearing officers. And then in Rebecca's staff, I'm going to let you do that with the monitoring, because then our office, there's a mechanism that's needed that when there's a dispute, we send it, or any complaints or any of the things that you see in our on that table, we send it to Rebecca's office so that they're made aware of. And there's ways that we need to strengthen that process, but so that she can go out and monitor the LEAs. Winnie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Myler. We have one staff member who does the IEP facilitation. So she arranges all of the facilitators who go to meetings with parents and districts, and that's part of her position. And then we do have monitoring. We have currently 9 people who do monitoring. We are just barely started a new monitoring process. We are in our first round of this monitoring, and we are in the process of hiring one individual who most of their focus will be on the information that comes from the governance unit, and then what the federal government has called due diligence reviews. So if we hear a complaint or we hear something from an outside entity, we have to do our due diligence and we have to determine if it's a credible allegation. So that is something that we've been developing, and it currently is posted right now. So we're in the process of fulfilling that position. So monitoring, I have people, but specifically for these things, it would be about 2.5 people if you wanted to, 1.5 people that you want to look in my department.
Follow up, please.
Yes.
Second part is Representative Ladd earlier said that about 85% of the department staff is funded through federal funds, specifically as it relates to your department.
Mm-hmm.
How much federal funds comes in, and are those funds directed at staffing, or is some of that funds directed to other department staff not related to special ed needs?
So all of our funding is either directed straight to the districts. We received $54 million last year from the federal government. We have not gotten our allocation for this coming year, so I don't know what that is. But a majority of that funding goes directly to districts, and we provide that to them based on an allocation, based on their child count and free and reduced lunch. It's a formula that I could go get somebody else to tell you. But we do provide most of it to them. And then the remaining money comes to us for discretionary funding or administrative funding. And then from the state, because I think that was your other question, we receive to process and run special education, we receive $219,000. That does not include the special education aid money that goes directly to districts or the court-ordered placement money and episode of treatment money that all goes directly to districts. We don't use any of that money to administer it, or it's just the 219 that we use to administer special education aid, court-ordered placements, and episodes of treatment.
I may, just to clarify, so your staff is basically funded primarily through federal funds, but the investigative piece is funded through state, is that correct?
So currently what we use our federal funding for salaries is, it pays for 20% of my salary. It pays for one staff member who oversees special education aid, court-ordered placements, and episodes of treatment. It pays for 3 clerks that come in and assist us with processing special education aid because it is a very short timeline to do that. We do that between July 30th and December 1st. So they come in for just that amount of time. And then it helps to pay for part of the due process hearing costs. It does not pay for all of it. It pays for just part of it.
Thank you.
Representative Terry, and then Representative Cascadden.
Thank you. When we look at the observations and we look at the recommendations, and then we note that in the vast majority of the instances, that is with respect to the observations and recommendations, that the department concurs or partially concurs, that in and of itself, I think, raises some very interesting questions. But those aside for the moment, let me ask you 2 questions. One, do you feel that with respect to your concurrence and partial concurrence, that you have the expertise to be able to implement the recommendations that have been made, at least to the extent that you agree with them? And then secondly, a very specific question with regard to the concern about unregulated agreement contents and I believe you heard the extensive comments that were made by Representative Cordelli with respect to non-disclosure agreements. As I note the NHED response on pages 100 and 101, I don't find that there is any content here that addresses the concern raised in the recommendation with respect to the non-disclosure agreements, which is very unsettling and troubling. So if you could answer those 2 questions.
Sure.
The first is, do you believe you have the expertise to be able to work on these recommendations to the extent that you agree with them? And then number 2, the lack of there being any response to the concern raised about the non-disclosure agreements in your department's response on pages 100 and 101. But would you please address for us now what your response would be to the troubling aspects that are raised with respect to non-disclosure agreements? Thanks.
Sure. I'm going to start, and then I'm going to hand it over to my attorney as well. So yes, we have the expertise, and I think that for as far as why we concur, I think that with many of these audit findings, we saw how we can strengthen our program, and they found things and unveiled things that maybe we didn't recognize at the time. So yes, we have the expertise. We'll be using Cadre, another resource. We'll be using the federal government's technical assistance. So yes, I think that we have the expertise. We have wonderful stakeholders with PIC and our advocates. So I feel very confident that we can come to great agreement to make some of these things happen. The second part of your question is sort of a 2-part. We had really robust conversations with the auditors about our authority of what we can impose on the LEAs. And historically, the department has not really played that role. And we have to be very careful as we move forward because we have to make sure that we have the resources and that we're not jamming up the system so that there aren't resolutions. And Diana, would you mind continuing with that?
Good morning. For the record, Diana Fenton. The non-disclosure agreements has been a source of concern for the department. And I will reiterate what the deputy commissioner just said, is that historically, this is a role the department has not played. And it was a refreshing, robust conversation with the auditors when it was brought to the department's attention that the department really does have more authority to enforce at the local level than historically we had been led to believe. That being said, the department has to be mindful as we take on that new role that we don't open ourselves up to any liability, recognizing that these are two-party agreements, and if the department were to suddenly impose itself, it could become a three-party agreement. And so anything we do in that area, we need to just do it in a mindful process. And so we will be working with the Attorney General's office, who is our legal counsel, to make sure that we don't cause unnecessary problems. But the non-disclosure agreements is something that has troubled not only this legislative body, but the department has been very aware of and very concerned about. And it's nice for the department to know that there are avenues by which they can be addressed.
Representative Cascade?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here. I guess I'm trying to think in big picture numbers whether dispute resolution processes have been have been requested more often, or has it been pretty consistent over the years? I don't know if you know, from like say for the last 10 years, or has there been a spike of an increase or a decrease, or how are we with numbers overall, to give me an idea on what's manageable?
Thank you for the question. It's interesting when you have audit findings going back to 1991 and 1999, these processes have existed in some form for a long time, and they've changed over time. They have morphed. Hopefully they've morphed to address the needs that are being seen. I can tell you that recently we have seen an uptick in the numbers, and I can certainly get you those exact numbers, but I think part of it is an interplay with getting the information out to the field, to the LEAs, to parents, the communication, keeping those lines of communication open, and then being responsive to those needs. And so we have seen an uptick in those just over the last, I would say, 3-4 years. And of course, I have to put a caveat on everything. The numbers during the pandemic threw off those statistics, right? And then we're seeing a response to that. And so when we look at it historically, we have to keep in mind what was happening kind of societally, if you will, because we have seen a response to that. Thank you.
Representative Luno?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Brennan, I have immense respect for you and many in the department, but I honestly, I was really surprised by your statement because it seems to contradict the findings and recommendations that are laid out in the audit report. And my question to you is, does the department recognize the gravity of the findings that are in here, and how do you square statements like calling some of these things shortcomings when there are findings in the report that say things like, and this is a quote, NHED could not provide reasonable assurance. Could not provide reasonable assurance the rights of children with disabilities and their parents were protected. And I guess what I'm asking you is could you convince me that the department does find this report to be serious?
Thank you so much for your question. Which page did you find that on, or what response?
That's at the top of 94.
Top of 94.
Yeah.
So first of all, we do take these audit reports. This is my second audit with the LBA, working when we had one with vocational rehab. And I find that these tools are a way for us to improve and to get better. I think we have 33,000 students with special education that have an IEP. I think when we look at some of the responses, I think that the auditors did a fantastic job, but to only think that 25 people responded to the parent survey and 25 special educators responded to the audit when we have about 172. I want to make sure that I just think that that's an important fact to be looking at this when we look at the audit. But I think that we want to have continuous improvement, and we want to make sure that we're doing that. So this is a tool to get us there.
I'm going to just follow up on where Representative Luno was, and I'm concerned, real concerned with this cost tracking and controls with our dealing with our contractors. And on page 61, this was alluded to, contractor payment controls were inadequate and insufficient to reduce possible, I won't put the word, to reduce fraud risk. Then I'm looking down on the bottom of that page, two of these contractor payment transactions, two conflicted with documentation and case records indicating invoiced work did not occur, resulting in potentially fraudulent payments. Have we identified fraud going on?
There is no fraud that's happening with our hearing officers. That was a technical error, and we have already worked with our Office of Business Administration to rectify our invoicing process and have had meetings with our vendors on how the invoicing must go. And I think that we are also working with our attorney to make sure that our contracts are better, more well-written.
And do you receive the invoiced work from the contractor before payment?
Yes. And we make sure that now that the deliverables that are in the contract are on the invoice, and I can get you a sample of the kind of invoices or receipts and documentation.
You don't have to do that.
Okay.
I'm believing what you're saying. I just want to make sure we're not going down a path we don't want to go down.
Yeah, that was, I think when the senator asked me, that was my first reaction of, oh my Lord, this cannot be true. But that was the first thing that we addressed, and it was minor. And we reviewed many others after the auditor shared this information with us. So I feel 100% confident that there is no fraud or payments that for work not being done.
And are those payments paid in the fiscal year in which they're doing this, or is it carried over where we had the issue with the $12,000?
Yeah, those are some of the decisions that we are making of when the hearing officers need, what's their period of performance? Because what happens is some of these cases are going on for a long time, and we really want to try to shorten that process so that kids can get the services they
One
need.
case over 1,000 days.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Representative Terry, and then Representative Myler.
It appears, to follow on, it appears as though you addressed that in your response on page 64, the question that's been put to you by Chairman Ladd. But as you do so, in the 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraph beginning DEBSES currently, the second sentence begins, the governance unit will modify hearing officer contracts. Can you, since that language has been submitted to the auditors, have you done so? And if not, what's the timeline for accomplishing this?
So that, wait,
Yeah.
yeah, I see where you're, I just want to read it to make
The
sure.
governance unit will modify hearing officer contracts to require invoice be submitted to NHED.
Within
So
within
where
90
are
days.
you in the process of modifying the hearing officer contracts? Since this verbiage has been included in the auditor's report, have you done so? Are you doing so? And if you haven't completed this, this commitment, when do you expect to complete it?
Well, the invoices have been completed, and we are,
We're talking about contracts now.
oh, the contracts,
The
okay.
governance unit will modify hearing officer contracts to require.
So when, I'm not sure of the timeline on the contracts, but they are typically 3-year contracts. And so when that contract comes up again, it would be modified to include that language. So that is something that the person who oversees that contract will be working on and will be doing. We initially wanted to make sure that the invoicing was done right away so that we could ensure that we were getting correct payments and there was no opportunity for fraud. So the contracts will be worked on.
Oh,
Yes.
so if the contracts, if you're pointing to a date in the future with respect to the language being modified, is there anything that you can do in the interim to ensure that this is taking place before you formalize it in contractual language? Or do we have to wait for this?
I think that there's opportunity for us to amend the contract, but I believe, and I don't want to give the incorrect information, but I think we are at the very end of the 3-year contract with the hearing officers.
Representative Myler?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of other questions. Obviously, you've had a chance to review this report, et cetera. And one of the key issues here, obviously, is the relationship between the department and the local school districts and the knowledge of those at the LEA level in understanding what the responsibilities are, et cetera. As a report, throughout the report, it talks about the need to make sure that there is an understanding of what the responsibilities are. So my question to you is, based upon the report and your review, what plans do you have to upscale and enhance the training of local special ed directors, for example, to make sure that there is compliance with the elements that are in this report? That's my first question.
Thank you. That's a great question. So I think what some of our plans are for making sure that the LEAs understand the dispute resolution process. We have partners like PIC that help educate them. We do trainings ourselves around the state, which we will now enhance and make it more systematic and so and in a policy so that it's ensured to continuously happen. Right now, we have to make sure that our LEAs are telling the parents at the meetings what their options are as far as the dispute resolution happens and what choices that they have. So we met with one of our advocates who had an idea of we already recognize that when a dispute or when a parent does not agree with an IEP, it's documented in Nessus. And we know that there's, it's partially, you're gonna have to get the terminology correct, but we have this information, we have this data, we can run reports. And so now we need to look at a systematic approach of how often do we run the report? How many parents, what districts are maybe continuously having dispute resolution processes? We have to start analyzing that kind of data and then coming up with a good implementation process. So that the LEAs understand the process and the parents do.
Two follow-ups, please. So do you have a schedule for these trainings? Are these episodic based upon your definition of what needs to be done at a particular school district level? So is there a training schedule for this that you've developed or what?
So we've always had trainings, but I think, again, we need to formalize it. And when we were doing the trainings before, it was kind of reactive to what were issues that were going in the field. But now I think we're going to have a formalized training schedule that will be posted. We'll make sure that our contractors know it. We'll make sure our stakeholders know it.
When is that scheduled to be posted?
I don't have an exact timeline, but I'll make sure. I think one of the senators said, how do we know that these things are getting completed? But we have to go to fiscal, I think it's quarterly, and give updates on some of the reports. And I'm sure that those schedules will be included and that information will be shared.
My final question is that as you look at your staffing in your department, Is it a correct assumption that when you hire somebody in that department, that they have field experience, that they've been a director of special ed, for example, at a school district level, that they in fact understand the law, that they're not just a casual special ed person, but they have an in-depth knowledge about what's going on?
Yeah, that's one of the, when we interview people for positions, that's one of the expectations. And sometimes there have been parents that know the process, the IEP process really well and understand all of the laws and processes well.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a number of recommendations made by LBA, 6 of which may require legislation. And we're hanging on to SB 340 right now and 443. 340 is dealing directly with IEPs, and 443 deals with transportation services for special education youngsters. Do you have, you've had this report for a bit here now. Are there any areas in which you have some suggestions for legislation right now that we could tack on? I can only hold on to these bills for at least another 30 days and then they're out. Do we want to use these bills as an avenue to trying to rectify some of your needs?
So I mentioned the two bills that we will need your support in to fix some of the confusion about the statutory requirements, but I'm going to let my teammates talk about the transportation and the other ones. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. So we do have the current House bills that were brought forward in response to the audit findings. I think we do have an opportunity to look at those Senate bills to see if there's some areas that we can be addressed. I think that when we look at these audit findings, we have to look at them in terms of the department as a whole and be very mindful in terms of our implementation. And I go back to the comment that was raised about our oversight and our work with the LEAs. I think that's a really important area. It is an area that is has a lot of opportunity, and I think it does need to be looked at very carefully. Again, I go back to the language in the audit report that the auditors, we had a very robust discussion with the auditors about the department's oversight of the LEAs, and historically the department has not acted in that capacity. And so as we look into this area, which is filled with opportunity, I would just want to do so very carefully so that the department does not open itself up to liability. But that would be the area that I would suggest we look at and this legislative body look at for those two retained Senate bills. I think that is a great area to start, and we
Thank you.
appreciate that opportunity. Thank you.
Representative Woodcock.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Brennan, thank you for being here. And I recognize as Representative Myler and Luno did, your competency and the leadership and the expertise you bring to the department. I appreciate that. But I need to say, I agree with Representative Luno. As I heard the last 2 or 3 minutes of your opening statement, it didn't resonate well with me, thinking that we have well over 75% of these 20 that your department agreed with of issues that are non-compliant and in error. And you close with, in my perception, well, everything's fine, we're doing well, and we're on track. And that's how it came to me, like, it just didn't resonate well, because I don't think everything's fine. I don't think everything's well. I don't think everything's on track. And this just supports that. And this is only a 2-year picture. And we look at it. So I just wanted to say that I have total faith in you, but I just was taking a step back listening to that closing.
Well,
Thank
thank you. And, I am an educator, so I do see the glass half full. And so I think it's, I apologize if it doesn't appear that I'm taking this serious, or I think that the audit has pinpointed some areas that we need to improve and need to work on. And I'm excited that we have the tool to make it better. But I do recognize that there were some deficiencies that they put out there. But I think that overall we have my team has done a great job making sure that people understand this very, very complicated process. And I apologize, like I said, if it was.
Apologize, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Luno.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to sort of go back to an area that's clearly within the department's framework, and it's observation 8, which Representative Ladd was referring to earlier, that we're questioning whether or not the department had adequate financial controls. And so this starts on page 60, but there's a response from the department on the bottom of 64 that reads, so the department concurs in part with the recommendations. And so the response on the bottom of 64 reads, NHED will assess the need to develop additional internal controls and update existing policies and procedures relating to the following: contract development, identification of fraud risk, improper payments, ability to recoup costs for any identified improper contract payments, and contractor payments in the appropriate fiscal year. How is the department going to, could you sort of talk about how the department will go about doing that, assessing the need to develop additional financial controls?
Sure. I mean, I think right now we have a very wonderful CFO at our department who oversees our business office, and she can review some of the processes that we have in place and make sure that they are fiscally responsible and that the internal controls are there. And then,
but what are they going to look at? How are they going to assess the need?
Assess the need for more internal
to develop additional internal controls.
Well, I mean, I think that that's a fiscal responsibility, and that we'll be working with our fiscal team to make sure that those happen. I'm not a fiscal expert, but I have full confidence on our team at the OBM office that they do.
Okay, thank you.
And Representative Luno, if I may add to that, I believe that the Department of Administrative Services also has further oversight on those fiscal controls, and I think those are policies that are always being developed. I'm not directly involved in that process. I personally struggle to get my travel reimbursement done correctly. But my understanding from my years of employment at the department and within the state is that that is an area that is beyond just the governance unit or the Department of Education. It's something that the state is constantly looking to work at. Fraud risk concerns all of us, regardless of the audit findings. That's always an issue. And so it's kind of an interplay between the office, the department's fiscal bureau and DAS and how that all works together. But it is an area that's constantly being worked on. So it's kind of our thoughts on it, but it's much bigger picture.
Follow up on that, Mr. Chair?
Yes,
I think that is, yes. Thanks. How does the administrative services know when to get involved in that type of fraud mitigation, policy review, assessing whether fraud has happened? How does DAS know when to get involved in that?
I'm a little out of my depth on that. I've never worked for DAS. Some of it is just kind of anecdotal from state employment experience. I think that there's two pieces to it. There's when fraud has occurred, and that's not what we're dealing with here. That's not the discussion. And then there's just the constant being proactive to address potential fraud risk. It's important that state government, regardless of what department you're talking about, remain being proactive rather than reactive. I think that's always a struggle for state government. And so I think just in terms of state government as a whole, that is obviously a concern for everyone here. And how do we make sure that our technology, our policies, our practices, and our procedures are always one step ahead to mitigate, identify, and detect any fraud risk.
One final follow-up on that. This section specifically relates to contractors. So wondering, will Department of Administrative Services as well as New Hampshire Education be able to assess what the fraud risk is and whether fraud has been exists, I guess, whether fraud has been committed when a contractor is involved.
And thank you for the question, Representative Leno. I want to be clear, there was no fraud. There are areas, however, where the department can be stronger in protecting against fraud and identifying fraud risk. And that is important to the department, it's important to our constituents. And when we look at our contract and our contract language, we will always look to strengthen that particular area. And we'll work with the Attorney General's office when we look at those contracts to see where we can strengthen it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we've had a number of contracts in other areas, you know, like minimum standards for public school approval, which we've contacted with retired superintendents. Some of those reports are sloppy. And, you know, done on a piece of paper and there it is, and here's your 12 grand for that report. I think that's what we need to do is tighten up our reporting to ensure that it's specific and it answers the questions that you're looking for. I've looked at a number of those others and I was appalled that I don't think you're doing that anymore. I think that contracted service has been stopped. But I agree. This is somewhere we have to work on. Are there any other questions from the committee right now? Representative Bress, go ahead, Representative Damon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for taking my question. So, broad picture, does the department, as it is currently staffed and funded, have the capacity to efficiently address the findings of the audit?
You want to know? I think that we would have to do a more comprehensive assessment of some of the things that we found here to be able to answer that question at this time, depending on what route the legislation takes and some of the things that they found in here. For example, using more of our authority in working with the LEAs.
Oh,
yes.
Thank you. Far more of the recommendations than not are not identified as having legislative involvement or potential solutions or approaches. So I would ask for some sense of timeline in the, we don't know if it's 45 or 90 days, 45 is really not very many, or the quarterly reporting, when the department would be able to say we have the resources to do this, or we need these kinds of resources. And I realize this is a big picture, comprehensive question, but it's the nuts and bolts of what the outcome of this is, not just a report sitting on a shelf.
Exactly. It would be helpful for us to come back after we have our training with the National Center of Improvement, Systematic Improvement this summer. Our whole team is going to this along with some of the special ed folks. And we're bringing our documents to get great technical assistance. And I think we'll have a very comprehensive picture of what our dispute resolution process will look like. And then we can be able to communicate it out and make sure that we have all the resources that are needed.
Would look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Hall.
Maybe it's not a question, but thank you. First of all, I taught special ed and was an LEA, and this report gives me high anxiety. I mean, high anxiety. I guess I would like to think, kind of in response to Representative Damon, that the fix here, and there are a lot of fixes, is not going to be to hire more people. You may end up hiring more people, but I hope that's not where it's going to start. So that's a concern I have about, there always seems to be a fix with hiring people. And I don't think that's the case. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think the legislature sometimes has to look in the mirror ourselves. We had a request come in from the department last year for an analyst to work with Caitlin Davis, and one of our committees rejected it. Came out of this committee unanimously. So it'd be nice to see what your priorities are in terms of staffing needs for a lot of areas. So are there any other questions from the committee here? Not so. I want to thank the department for
Thank you.
coming forward and trying to respond to some of our questions. And thank you very much, Commissioner
Thank you.
Brennan. Are there any other groups that is the special education advocate here right now? Kristen, do you have any comments, final comments for us? Because this is part of your bailiwick.
Kristen Montrovani, Office of the Advocate for Special Education. I'm not going to speak for long, but I did read the report as soon as it came out. It was not surprising. I've seen many of those things in the past 6+ months, 7 months, 8 months, representing the interests of parents. I would say some things. I have sat down with the department on a few occasions prior, but since this report came out, and we have discussed where some of those fixes should start. I think one of the things we're going to need to do is group some of these recommendations and observations. But you're always going to hear me talk in specifics and not generalizations just to address by way of example. A couple of the things that have come up, Representative Luno, for example, asked a question about timelines, and it goes to all of your broad questions about the department concurring in part with these recommendations. And so I would say to use a timeline specific question, but it goes to so many of these issues. What I see is that the department is complying with federal regulations and really making good efforts in the sense that there is a process. When a parent files for due process, they get a very well laid out statement of, here are your timelines, here's your hearing officer, here are the dates on which all of these things will happen, and they are compliant with the statutes and regulations. I think some of the issue throughout this report, and I don't know, I haven't discussed this specifically with the department, but the concurrence in part would be there's not great tracking later on. And it doesn't mean it's not happening, because my experience with the hearing officers is that they are holding those timelines. They're very conscious of them. So it doesn't mean that we're so far off for the majority on all of those timelines. It's that the tracking retrospectively of what happened in each case isn't necessarily there. Representative Cordelli asked about Nessus versus other databases being kept by the department. I think that really is an issue to look at. How much information could we get out of Nessus that the department could start incorporating into its oversight? And we have had that conversation in the last week, in fact. And then once they're doing some of that, providing some technical guidance to the LEAs, looking at information that's available across the 30,000 student population, starting a big picture report there, and then funneling it down to better reporting on the tracking of the honestly small area of dispute resolution, right? Because of the 30,000 special ed cases, as you've correctly pointed out, there are two sides, there's another audit, only a small portion of them go to dispute resolution. So I don't think the better tracking of some of those questions is really as overwhelming as it might appear initially, and it's certainly something we're discussing in terms of recommendations, because the more we track, the more we understand really the problem, and we understand where more oversight is needed from the department to the LEAs. My office is certainly going to be making recommendations, has already, about some technical advisories we'd love to see coming from the department to LEAs on some of these points, because it is true that a lot of them do not know some of the compliance pieces that they're supposed to be ensuring at the local level. It's come up frequently in the past month, actually, in talking about some of the findings of this audit. But definitely working, I look forward to working in collaboration, and I think we'll find that some of the problems are more about tracking and reporting and those metrics, and that once that is done better, we'll have a better idea of how much is substance and how much is kind of the reporting processes that are at issue.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from, yes, Representative Luno?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for sharing some thoughts on this. I was wondering, in your experience, how are we doing in New Hampshire compared with other states like, I don't know, Massachusetts, New Jersey, pick a few. And I'm talking about in terms of not just the number of complaints. I mean, we're at around 1%, I think, just looking at the numbers. But the processes in general and things like that.
We could tighten up some of the processes. Representative Cordelli indicated the tracking, for example, of parental refusals, partial refusals, or partial consents, depending on how you look at it. But that's going to matter in terms of how we track it in the data, whether we track it as a partial refusal or partial consent. The reporting of those help us understand, okay, well, let's say only 1% are going to any kind of complaint or dispute resolution. How should we look at that? If we have high levels of refusals, then it's not a good thing if 1% are going. But that's the kind of data that we've been discussing that we don't seem to have readily available and clean just yet, that I think doesn't have to be a particularly difficult fix. It's one of the areas that I would like my office to focus on in collaboration with the department, because then we would be able to better answer your question. Tracking refusals, some other states are doing it much better. Honestly, parents refuse their IEP and they get from the bureaus of dispute resolution, whatever they are termed in that state, pretty quickly a letter. We understand you refused. Here's a guide. Here's how you go about pursuing those rights. So in that case, I think you would probably find there are fewer sitting, getting stale, disputes or IEPs where students are not getting services over a long period of time because parents may not feel empowered to bring a case to a resolution. And in some instances, we have to provide LEAs with the advice that it is their responsibility to bring some of these cases to resolution under the law. And that's not happening in some instances where you could really say the LEA didn't have the right to just sit on this dispute. If the parents weren't bringing it, they needed to. It had to be resolved in some manner. So that's also a place where my office will be working. I hope that answers your question to a degree.
Further questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, with hearing now from the special advocate, the department, and the LBA, we want to thank people and thank you very much for this audit report. A lot of work in it and a lot of future work, I hope, comes from it. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to close this session. Thank you.
My drawer is empty. Anyway, I gotta run because I want to.
Awesome. Well, another meeting.
Well.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.